It was a very long time ago, back in 1973. I know it was summer, I was 6, and we were living on Monica Lane in Madison, Wisconsin. The thing is, I sort of recalled it, but never put 2 and 2 together until a few months ago when I was talking to my mom. She went into great detail about everything that happened. I was a very gregarious child, you see. Outgoing, extroverted, friends with anyone. It was at the time a middle-class neighborhood, and 3 houses down from ours on the same side of the street was this huge park. My mom was a nurse, and my dad was a salesman. My mom worked second shift at Meritor, while my dad worked days. I rarely had a babysitter, only if they'd go out for dinner or a movie usually. They went out often enough, but there were usually always older kids in the neighborhood to babysit anyway. One sitter who I really liked lived a few blocks or so away, just down the street a bit. Vicky had babysat a few times before that, and it had always been pretty uneventful. She'd play games with me, do my hair, play dress up, all pretty basic stuff. Anyhow, one day I had gone with my friends over to the park. I remember there was a ball field at the time, and a sand lot right next to that field. My friends wanted to play on the monkey bars, but I wanted to go and play in the sand instead. I looked over at the sandbox, and my babysitter Vicky was standing right there. I told my friends where I was going and ran off to play. We played in the sandbox together, building a castle, and then she asked me if I wanted to go get something cold to drink. It was stifling hot, so of course I said yes. She grabbed my hand and we started walking to her place. At this point, she started telling me about all her puppies and asking if I wanted to play with them. Of course, I got very giddy and now couldn't wait to get over to her house. This is where my memory just kinda stopped. After my mom told me what happened, the rest of it just flooded back into my mind. My mother just happened to be talking to my sister and I about some of the places we'd lived and got on to Monica Lane. I told her I remembered the park and how big it seemed, and then she asked me if I remembered being kidnapped as a child. I immediately thought she was kidding, but the look on her face told me otherwise. She said it had been around 5 in the afternoon when one of my friends had come to the door to ask why I hadn't come back outside. They were sure I'd just gotten bored and walked back home. Well, when my mom checked the house, she realized I was not there. Even 7 months pregnant with my sister, she sprinted down to the park screaming my name. After asking several kids if they'd seen me with no clues, she went down to the baseball field and asked the older boys if they'd seen me either. One of the boys said he'd seen a younger woman playing with a girl that fit my description in the sand and walking off in a general direction. That was all he knew. My mom ran across the street to one of the houses and asked to use their phone and call the police. By the time they got there, my dad had already come home and grabbed some of the neighbors to try and help my mom find me. So here we are, this big search party out looking for me, screaming my name and knocking on all the doors. The police had gone back to the park to ask the boys if they knew who had been with me and if they knew who she was. Between the boys and neighbors, they deduced who it was that had led me off. The police and the entourage went to her home. She lived with her parents at the time, but they didn't seem to be there. Of course, when they knocked on the door and she answered, she told them she hadn't seen me all day. She'd been home alone. The police asked to come in, and for some strange reason, she said okay. They went through the house and went into the basement, where they found me. That's what my mom knew, and then I remembered. It was like a floodgate had opened, and I started crying. At 6, you sort of trust everyone, and she'd been in our home many times before. I'd never gotten a bad feeling from her, and my parents had never gotten one either. I remember though, the instant we walked through the threshold to her house, that cold holy fuck feeling just washing over me, and immediately getting very worried. I remember starting to cry and telling her I wanted to go home, over and over. She pushed me into her kitchen and grabbed me a glass of water and a tissue. I could hear dogs barking, and next to the kitchen there was an open stairway that went down to the basement, where all that barking was coming from. At this point, she started trying to cajole me into going downstairs, telling me there were all sorts of wonderful toys and games. I reluctantly agreed, not knowing what to do, and she grabbed my hand to head down those stairs. At this point, the dogs were going even nuttier, so I started screaming. Vicky was getting downright bizarre. She turned to me and started screaming, "Shut the fuck up! If you don't shut up right now, I'll throw you in the cage with those dogs and they'll eat you! Shut up!" Dragging me down the stairs, still screaming. I was scared out of my mind. I remember crying so hard I was hyperventilating, screaming so hard I wasn't even making sounds anymore. Then she just flipped a switch and started being syrupy sweet, trying to calm me down. She told me she was just playing a game and told me she wanted to play hide and seek now. She must have been relatively skilled at calming a child, because next thing I knew, I heard knocking on the door upstairs and I was no longer crying. The houses were all the same sort of tract houses that Sears used to sell. Not huge, but not small either. You could hear everything at any spot in the house. I kept on hearing that insistent knocking, and she told me it was her friends coming to play hide and seek. She put a piece of masking tape over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound, and lifted me into this big wooden box next to the kennel. She put a big pile of blankets over me as well, and told me to stay silent so they wouldn't find me. The whole time, the dogs were going batshit as well. She tried to calm them down too. They still looked incredibly mean, but were no longer frothing at the mouth, only slightly growling. I remember scrunching in there confused, still convinced the dogs were going to break out and eat me. I was crying again, hyperventilating. I remember managing to take the tape off my mouth because I couldn't breathe. But then I remembered I needed to be quiet because I was afraid of what she'd do if they heard me. I laid in that smelly box next to a bag of old dog food, sweating to hell with tears rolling down my face. I sort of pushed the blankets to the side, but only enough so that I could pull them back over me when someone came. I remember thinking about my dad and wondering if he'd come to find me. All of a sudden, I could hear what sounded like people yelling my name. They rushed down the stairs and the dogs were going batshit again. I was in a large storage box with tape hanging off my mouth when they opened the lid. I remember a very nice man asking my name and if I was okay. I don't remember answering him in anything other than screams and tears, grabbing his neck so hard my dad had to practically pry me off of him. My parents took me to the hospital to be checked out, and that's really all I remember. Mom said Vicky was found guilty of attempted kidnapping. Last she knew, Vicky was in prison still, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard anything. We moved from the area shortly thereafter, and never went back since. I do know Mom said her parents were odd, but they didn't know them. She had met Vicky from neighbors that had used her as a babysitter before. No one had ever said anything bad about her, and she never seemed to display any troubling behavior either. She lived in the general neighborhood, but it would have been 2 blocks over and 1 block down. They never picked her up. She would always walk over to our house. Then they'd get home and they'd drive her home, but never noticed anything out of the ordinary. The only time we ever met her parents was when they came to the door to beg forgiveness, that Vicky hadn't meant to do anything bad and was a good girl. Mom said my dad picked up her dad by the shirt and told him if they ever came onto our property again, he'd kill them. I remember her name and sort of what she looked like, but if she walked up to me now, I don't think I'd have any idea who she was. This is a story that I was told by my mother when I was old enough to understand what almost happened. I was only a few weeks old when this occurred, and in those days when a mother had given birth and taken their baby home, midwives were sent from the hospital to check on the baby and mother once or twice a week max. My dad was working a lot at the time, so he wasn't home. My mother had put me to sleep and was going about her business in the house. These visits would only be every week or so, and she had just had 2 midwives come during the morning one day before. Immediately, she knew what happened next was not normal. She had a sudden knock at the door, and so went to open it. We lived in a fairly close-knit community where there was rarely any threats to safety. Most of the people who lived nearby worked the whole day, as they were young, healthy couples. This meant it was fairly deserted at this time. My mother was greeted by a male and a female who were dressed in midwifery outfits with hospital badges and everything. They were very polite and asked if they could come inside. They explained they had been sent by the hospital to check on her and the new baby. My mom let them in, as they had all the professional clothes and badges and everything they should. They even knew the exact time my mother had given birth. They knew she had a little girl, my mother's name, very convincing. Also, all info that's easy to access in hindsight, I guess. The man said he was going to take me upstairs and check over me, and the female would check over my mother downstairs. Well, my mother didn't feel okay about them wanting to separate us, and explained that a pair of midwives had already been that week. She told them she was going to ring the hospital to check with them. Nobody had notified her that more were going to be coming just a day or two after. She also warned them that her husband was on his way home from work and wouldn't be very happy about this. At this point, the pair got very defensive and said they would leave after being really pushy with my mother to separate the two of us. Finally, though, she got them to go. They quickly changed their behavior, calming down and saying not to worry. It must have just been a mistake. Don't bother checking with the hospital. My mom kept on trying to contact them, though. What was even weirder is that when my mom opened the door to make them leave, there was another person waiting in a car outside who still had the engine running. Probably the getaway driver, I'd guess. Of course, immediately as they left, my mother, quite scared now, rang the hospital, who said they had not sent any midwives to visit me and my mother. They would always alert the mother if they were going to send them. They would also never ask to separate the mother and baby. When they asked for descriptions of these midwives, they said they didn't even have a male midwife at the hospital where I was born, and to contact the police immediately. Terrified, my mother called my dad, who came straight home, and they reported it to the police. They took down a description, but as far as I know, it never amounted to anything. Who knows what that pair was planning? It's so creepy how they had access to all that information. Even the time that my mother had given birth to me. They must have been watching the house for a while to know my father wasn't home as well. They had even gone through the effort of having a fake uniform and badges made. And thank God my mother acted on her instinct and got them the hell out of the house and stuck to her guns. It's even more creepy to imagine what my life would be now if they had gotten to carry out whatever they were planning. I don't believe it was a genuine mix-up. They didn't follow standard protocol in warning my mother they were visiting, and they were very insistent on getting the two of us apart. I believe we were very lucky that day. This is definitely a childhood memory of mine that I will never forget. I'm female and 22, by the way. Growing up, my aunt and uncle owned a beach condo. My favorite way to spend the summer was to stay there with my family, specifically my cousin Charlie. We were absolutely inseparable growing up. There was a 1-year difference between us. The beach we stayed at was a very popular tourist beach on the SC coast. So, in the summer, it was incredibly busy. I mean, barely any room between you and the family next to you. Now, my family would spend all day on that beach, from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. The beach would stay crowded until about 5, when everyone would go back to their rooms to shower and go out to eat. This meant from around 5 to 7 every day. That was my favorite time to be outside. We would have all the room to run wild, build sandcastles, dig huge holes. We wouldn't have to worry about people knocking them down or being too close. Around 5:30 p.m. one day, my family decided they wanted to walk to the pier about 2 miles away. Charlie and I, though, begged to stay behind so we could build sandcastles together. We were 9 and 10 at the time, so they said we could stay as long as we didn't get in the water or leave our spot. The condo we stayed at was one row back, and we were not allowed to cross the street without adults. We agreed to their terms and continued to build a row of sandcastles as they walked off into the distance. Around 5 minutes later, though, this extremely tall man wearing this floppy beach hat, sunglasses, and with a dollop of sunscreen on his nose came running straight up to us. He started by commenting how beautiful our sandcastles were, asking how long it took us to build them that high. He also asked if it was just the two of us working on them. We were both extremely introverted kids. We thanked him and kept our answers short and tried to ignore him as he stood there watching us. All of a sudden, he got real quiet and started to glance around at the mostly empty beach. Then he said he had to go meet a friend of his. He told us to stay right there so he could bring his friend back to look at how great our sandcastles were. Then he jogged away from us. When he'd gotten a safe distance, Charlie and I both looked at each other and said, "We've gotta get out of here." Side note, hell yeah at us for being smart kids. We immediately started weighing our options. We knew our family wouldn't be back for at least another 30 minutes. We also knew we weren't allowed to cross the street, and quite frankly, we were scared too. About 100 yards away, though, was a tiny ramp overlooking the ocean. I believe it was a handicap access to the beach, as well as just a place to sit down, I guess. We grabbed our big shovels and decided to hollow out underneath that thing enough to where we could crawl under and not be seen. It didn't take us very long, since the high tide over the years had taken out a good 3 feet of sand underneath. Our adrenaline was rushing mad fast too. We took our shovels inside with us and crawled underneath. The man was still yet to be seen. I assume it took us all of 8 minutes to climb under the pier and bury it again. Our heads were partially visible above the sand horizon, and we started freaking out, thinking he would surely be able to spot us if he just looked hard enough. There were 2 boogie boards lying about 50 feet away, though. It looked like some kids had abandoned them there. We grabbed them and propped them up against the ramp, covering our crawl space and the top of our heads from sight. Charlie curled up in a ball and cried, while running scenarios by me that we were definitely going to get taken. I tried my best to calm him down and say everything was going to be okay. Our parents would be back soon enough. I definitely felt like crying myself, though. The whole thing was so weird. I knew that since we both had such a bad feeling about the situation, especially at such a young age, this man was definitely having sinister intentions. Charles and I tried to peek out of the tiny slits where the boogie boards curved, and eventually saw the man walking back. He didn't have anyone with him, which we definitely thought he would since he said he was going to bring friends. As we observed, we noticed the man had seen we were gone. He turned around several times, checking to see if we were in the ocean or by the dunes. Once he realized and didn't seem to notice us that we were gone, he got extremely angry. He started huffing, puffing, stomping around. He looked over to our sandcastles and kicked them all down. We'd built a ton over the course of the day and basically had a gigantic wall of them. He made sure to kick every single one down before storming away. We stayed under that ramp thing for 45 more minutes until our family got back. We were way too scared to come out, especially after seeing the man's irrational reaction. We cried and told our family what had happened, and of course, they didn't believe us. We still talk about it sometimes at family gatherings or holidays. Both of us still remember it like it was yesterday. This happened back when I was 21 and living downtown with my boyfriend. I had just found out that my boyfriend, who I'd been with for 4 years, had been cheating on me for a while. We were invited to a Halloween party that night. I had initially declined the invite, but then I found out about the cheating and told him I was going and he could stay home for all I cared. We were in the process of breaking up and dividing our assets. Anyway, the breakup is relevant to my frame of mind. We lived in a rather sketchy area downtown. One of those brand new apartments built in a slummy area sort of things. Any other night, I'm the type who keeps the windows up and all doors locked until out of the area immediately surrounding our apartment. That night, though, my mind was understandably elsewhere. I had both driver and passenger windows down so I could smoke a cigarette. The first red light I came to on the way to the party was still in the shady part of town. I was the first car at the light, so I had a full view of a 20-something guy crossing the crosswalk left to right in front of my car. Suddenly, he looked over and made eye contact with me. I was flicking ash from my cigarette out the window at this point, and may have done a polite head nod or something. I can't really remember. Next thing I know, though, he jogged right over to my open passenger window and leaned into my car, asking if he could have a light. I was so flustered that without even really thinking, I handed him my lighter. I was prepared to just pull away when the light turned green and let him have that damn thing. That's when, instead of reaching for the lighter though, he reached into my car and just let himself in. He sat right down like we were the best of old friends. At this point, the light finally turned green. I grabbed my purse and wedged it between my left leg and the driver's side door. Apparently, I was more concerned with being robbed than the darker alternative. The man thanked me for giving him a ride like it was the most natural thing. I slowly pulled away from the stoplight since cars were behind me and asked why he'd gotten into my car. He replied he could tell I wanted to give him one, and launched into an obviously fabricated story about needing a ride because his girlfriend had just broken up with him and left him stranded downtown. I told him I'd take him to the nearest gas station, as I needed to get gas. I didn't, of course. This was just the closest location where I could stop and was sure to have people. The gas station was only about 6 blocks away, but it was the longest 6 blocks of my life. He told me I was pretty and asked me if I could give him money so he could get a cab home. Like an idiot, I offered him the $4 in quarters I keep in my car for the parking meters. At this point, I think I was just ready to make him stop talking and leave me alone. Instead, though, he started throwing the quarters one by one down the cleavage of my shirt and started laughing at me. Finally, I saw the gas station. I pulled in and told him we both needed to get out so I could pump. He hesitated, but finally did get out. I never locked my car doors so fast in my life. I walked inside, telling him I needed to prepay. Instead, I found the first group of people I could and explained the situation. At this time, a guy with the group I was talking to came in and told his buddies that the guy out there was telling him I was his girlfriend, and I'd accidentally driven away with my purse on top of the car. The college kids ended up going outside and making him leave, then stuck around until I was back in my car and on my way.